There's almost certainly more to the character of Enver Gortash than meets the eye, and if you recall in the previous video, I suggested towards the end of that video that he may in fact have little to do with the Absolute in terms of his allegiances, and whatever nominal alliance exists between the two might simply be one of convenience, or maybe something altogether different. Furthermore, some people have suggested that he possibly is not a villain and far more of an antagonist. At least within literary criteria, there is no clear distinction necessarily between an antagonist and a villain, as an antagonist serves a critical role in driving the story forward by opposing the protagonist, in this case the PC. What I wish to say here is that being an antagonist does not exclude one from being a villain, or vice versa. It is perfectly plausible to have a villainous antagonist, or one for that matter, who is not a villain. What was implied, however, was that his loyalties might be more flexible than someone, say, of Ketheric Thorm's background, and that is probably true, but then again, it might not be. There are many theories that we could explore to tease out the character of Enver Gortash, who he is, and what role he might ultimately play in the game, but there's one in particular that I'd like to explore. Let's dive right in. Now, unfortunately, after publishing the previous video, in which I initially suggested that Gortash is probably a mage, I've since discovered several tweets by Larian that might cast doubt upon that theory, suggesting that he may possibly be an artificer, a class first published in Unearthed Arcana in 5th edition, and therefore not part of the player's handbook, but could still make it into the game, at least theoretically. Based on tweets, Gortash does in fact seem to be the ultimate master and likely creator of the massive automatons called Steel Watchers we have seen in the trailer, but I am not convinced that this makes him an artificer. Indeed, he bears none of the trappings of that class, something one would expect of a character of his standing, and he carries none of the paraphernalia, the tools, or other accoutrements that we have come to expect of the artificer. Alternatively, given his background with devils and the seeming fact that he was quote-unquote raised by a devil, it has been suggested that he might be a warlock, or at least might have been one until breaking free of his former master. Quote, Lord Enver Gortash freed himself of his bonds to envision wonders and become a master of both men and mechanisms. End quote. How plausible is the scenario that he may in fact be a former warlock? It's probably much more likely than that of an artificer, to be frank, for a number of reasons. Artificers usually have no contact with the infernal, and warlocks do. And although rare and difficult to pull off, it is possible that a warlock could break free from their patron and still retain their powers. And this is primarily possible because unlike clerics, who pray to gods, warlocks learn secrets, or rather knowledge from their patrons, rather than being granted power directly by them. This means that essentially, warlocks are taught, and knowledge can be retained, although occasionally they are granted powers in a more direct way. And thus, it is possible, though not probable, that a warlock could break a pact and retain the dark knowledge he had acquired in service to his patron. This has happened with both Archfey and Fiend warlocks in the past, so it is something we have to consider in the matter of Gortash. Of course, this does nothing to explain the automatons, nor his mastery of them. But it would not be entirely impossible to make use of infernal magic to gain control over such constructs. We simply do not know. But if I were a betting man, I would lean more heavily towards warlock or former warlock than mage or artificer. The real question here is if Gortash has freed himself from his bonds, what were those bonds? We've already considered his warlock status, but that does not imply he was raised by a devil. Here we can only speculate. But if he has freed himself of his bonds, then the implication, far more than having been raised by a devil, is that he was enslaved by a devil, at a very young age perhaps, and that he learnt the ways of political backstabbing and maneuvering by observing infernal behavior and machinations. How then did he manage to escape his bonds? Here, we might appeal to a theory which could truly be game-changing in terms of the politics and power struggles of Baldur's Gate, if it turned out to be true. I had already mentioned the infernal-looking skulls and heads embroidered into Gortash's robes the other day. They're hard to miss. But what, or whom, might they represent? We already know that there are many gods afoot in the Forgotten Realms, and more than just one or two have their fingers in the pie of Baldur's Gate 3. And if Hilarion is as clever as I think they are, a new god may have just entered the scene. Lord Enver Gortash appears to be the consummate corrupt and backstabbing politician, thoroughly lawful evil, an individual for whom the law is but a tool to gain advantage over others, never something used in the service of others. And it just so happens that there is a deity that fits the bill of just such a person. A deity that someone like that would look up to. And even more conveniently, a deity that is at once close to devils, but also separate from them. Although he is paradoxically one himself, and one with a little bit of history in Baldur's Gate. This deity is none other than Gargauth, the hidden lord and the exile. Gargauth is the demigod of betrayal, cruelty, and political corruption, a wholly malevolent, albeit lawful being that embodies the worst of organized evil, and who was allegedly so malicious in temperament that he was cast out of the nine hells themselves for being too foul to bear, even for the likes of the devils, which speaks volumes for this demigod. Gargauth embodies the unavoidable natural moral decay that takes root in men when victories are achieved without regard for the common good, and the corruption that rots away at individuals from within. The infernal skulls that adorn Gortash's robe do not seem haphazardly placed, nor is their appearance random. In fact, they resemble much of the common religious iconography and depictions of Gargauth, and indeed many of Gargauth's worshippers commonly wear masks of this sort, or jewelry, so much so that they are impossible to ignore in this regard. It almost seems as if Gortash might worship the fallen devil-turned-demigod. A little background information and history on the deity Gargauth is required in order that we might better understand how Gortash may have come to worship him. Gargauth was once one of the extremely powerful lords of the Nine Hells' most powerful devils, but although for reasons not entirely known, he was banished many eons ago, purportedly for being too evil for even his own ilk, although this is more of a rumor than it is a truth. Despite this, Gargauth maintains reasonably warm relations with many of the denizens of the Hells, as much as a devil could, of course, and even some of the most powerful of devils, including, and strangely enough, Asmodeus himself, the Lord of the Ninth and the Master of the Nine Hells. Since leaving the Hells for Faerûn, Gargauth has managed to amass a non-trivial amount of power for himself, and is considered a demigod, powerful enough to have a clergy and grant spells to them, as well as attract new worshippers seeking to climb the ranks of political hierarchy. Despite his intense evil and self-serving nature, he is a master of feigning compassion and goodwill, which is a skill much coveted by any evil politician, and perhaps a major reason why his faithful revere him in the first place. But there are other reasons why it is very possible that Gortash might worship Gargauth. Although Gargauth is nominally on good terms with the devils of the Hells, in secret he vies against many of them, and even possesses a unique power, an extremely closely guarded secret. Gargauth possesses the ability to absorb the power of devils that he physically encounters upon slaying them, adding that power to his own. If the powers of the Hells knew about this ability, they would surely rally against the Hidden Lord, but they don't know. And what if Gargauth had used this ability on Gortash's former Devil Master to empower himself? And what if it had left such an impression on Gortash that he committed himself to worshipping the demigod? Now, interestingly enough, Gortash is not the only connection that Gargauth has to the city of Baldur's Gate. You will recall that the city is ruled by the Council of Four, influential members of Baldurian society that are elected for life. One of them, a woman called Belin Stelmane, has a number of secrets. On the one hand, she has been fighting off the mental influence of an illithid striving to take control of her body telepathically for a very long time. And this may or may not be a coincidence with respect to the illithid tadpoles. But perhaps even more important to the discussion is the fact that she is a secret member of an organization called the Knights of the Shield, an organization that ultimately acts in the service of none other than Gargauth himself. Superficially, the Knights of the Shield appear to be primarily interested in influencing mercantile and political affairs of the Sword Coast, and actually do pursue these goals regularly. But unknown to outsiders and even normal members, The highest leadership seeks to serve the Hidden Lord. Centuries ago, Gargauth had taken over an artifact that has come to be called the Shield of the Hidden Lord, originally a celestial object, but later corrupted by his infernal presence, and still later, Gargauth even became trapped in the shield during the events of the Spell Plague. And in fact, it was Gargauth who influenced and changed the original directives of the Knights of the Shield centuries ago and brought them into his fold. Gargauth has since then managed to escape the shield, but his influence on the Knights of the Shield, and by extension, the Council of Four member Spell&Shield remains. For a while when trapped in the shield, Gargauth had even managed to drive the inhabitants of Baldur's Gate to greed and hatred, as he tends to do so whenever he spends a prolonged period of time in any place. And perhaps more relevant than any of this is the fact that, little known to the citizens of Baldur's Gate, Gargauth actually has a temple hidden beneath the hustle and bustle of the city streets, only accessible by way of deep pits and dark passageways, where the faithful come to worship and plot. And there is yet another aspect to the deity Gargauth that should be taken into consideration in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, and that is his very poor relations with other gods. Gargauth has never gotten along with the likes of Bane and Baal, two of the Dead Three, and obviously major players in the story of Baldur's Gate 3, to the point where, in former times, Gargauth would actively encourage his worshippers to oppose them. All of these details come together to allow us to formulate a plausible theory about Gargauth, Gortash, and the city of Baldur's Gate. Gortash once labored under the yoke of a devil, perhaps as a warlock, perhaps as something else, but was freed in no small part due to the influence of Gargauth, whom he saw worthy of worship. Although in it for himself, as all worshippers of such an evil deity are, he is possibly allied with Spell&Shield and the Knights of the Shield. And all these people are at odds with the plans and desires of the Dead Three, i.e. the Absolute. If this turns out to be true, then the layers of intrigue, betrayal, and backstabbing in a video game will have been taken to new heights by Lorien, and I sincerely hope that this theory actually does turn out to be true. What about you, though? What do you think ultimately drives the character called Lord Enver Gortash? Let me know in the comment section. And before going, I'd like to let you know that I've created a Discord server for my subscribers to join to discuss all matters RPG and matters related. Hope to see you there. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. And I'll check you out next time. Take care.